There is a particular kind of silence that has nothing to do with having nothing to say, and you have probably seen it before, in a room, across a table, or in the space between two people who have known each other for decades. He goes quiet at exactly the moment when something real is being asked of him, not because he is withholding, not because he is angry, not because the question doesn't matter. He goes quiet because the interior architecture required to answer that question was never built. Something happened between what he felt and what he was allowed to call it, and that gap didn't appear overnight. It was constructed layer by layer over the first 20 years of his life, and then maintained, without much effort, for the 30 years that followed. This is where the investigation begins, not with a dramatic moment, not with a single wound, but with something far more ordinary and far more durable: the daily, unremarkable absence of emotional language in the environments where he grew up. He was born somewhere between 1965 and 1980, and the world he entered was not hostile to emotion in any obvious or theatrical way. It was simply indifferent to it. The men around him, his father, his uncles, his coaches, the men on television, operated from a register of behavior that had almost nothing to do with internal states. You watched what they did. You did not ask what they felt. That distinction was never announced. It was simply the operating assumption of every room he entered as a boy. And the boy, as boys always do, absorbed it completely. He didn't learn that emotions were dangerous. He learned something subtler and more permanent than that. He learned that emotions were not especially relevant data. You felt something, and then you continued. The feeling was not a signal to investigate, not an invitation to language. It was weather, something that happened around you while you kept moving. This is the first behavioral pattern worth examining, because it looks from the outside like composure. It looks like maturity. It looks like a man who has his emotional life under control, and the observer who doesn't look closely enough will stop there and call it stability. But the investigation doesn't stop there, because composure and absence are not the same thing, and the distinction between them is precisely what has remained unnamed for 50 years. Watch him in a conversation that turns unexpectedly personal. His body makes a very small adjustment. The posture doesn't collapse, the expression doesn't change dramatically, but something withdraws, something almost imperceptible, as if a door closed 1 inch and no one was supposed to notice. He redirects. He offers a fact where a feeling was requested. He makes a quiet joke or asks a question about you. These are not manipulative moves. They are automatic, happening at a speed that precedes conscious decision, which means they are not defenses in the way that word is usually used. They are the natural operation of a system that was built without the relevant infrastructure. You cannot retrieve something from a room that was never constructed. The infrastructure question is worth staying with, because when people talk about emotional suppression, they typically imagine something active, a man actively pushing feelings down, actively refusing to speak, actively choosing silence over vulnerability. That model doesn't describe most Gen X men with any accuracy. Suppression implies something was there to be suppressed.
What the investigation finds when it looks closely enough is something different. A vocabulary that was never acquired, not hidden, not buried, not locked away, but simply never given. A child learns the names of things because adults in his environment consistently name them, and emotional language works by the same mechanism. You learn the name of what you feel because someone around you consistently names it, not just in their own experience, but in yours. You seem frustrated right now. That must have been frightening. It sounds like you felt left out. These sentences do more than describe. They install the category, teaching the nervous system that this interior state is a distinct, nameable phenomenon, something real enough to have a word, something observable enough to be reflected back. For a large number of Gen X boys, those sentences were almost entirely absent. It was not cruelty. It is important to say that clearly and without sentimentality, because the investigation is not interested in blame, and blame would distort what is actually visible here. The fathers of Gen X men were in most cases doing exactly what their own fathers had done. They provided, they protected, they showed up, and they communicated love through action, through presence at the game, through food on the table, through a car that started, through a roof that didn't leak. That was the emotional language they had inherited, and they passed it on with complete sincerity. The boy received it, understood it at the level it was offered, and learned that love is demonstrated through reliability, through competence, through not making your interior life a burden on the people around you. He did not learn that love could also be demonstrated through language, through the act of naming, through the practice of sitting with someone inside an uncomfortable feeling long enough to call it something. That lesson was not available in the curriculum. So the boy grew up and became competent in the domains that were modeled for him. He learned to fix things, to work, to solve problems with a kind of lateral intelligence that comes from never having been taught to look inward. Because looking inward and then looking outward, scanning for a practical response, is a remarkably efficient system for navigating a world that rewards output. He became, by most observable metrics, functional, and functionality was the standard being applied. No one was measuring something else. No one was asking what it cost him to operate this way. The cost was not part of the accounting. Now he is 50 or 55 or closer to 60 than he expected to be this quickly, and the investigation notices something that has changed, not in him, but in the world around him. The emotional vocabulary that was absent from his formation is now everywhere. His children use it fluently. His younger colleagues use it in workplace meetings with a casualness that still, if he is honest, startles him slightly. The culture has shifted. The language has arrived. And he finds himself in the strange position of living inside a world that now expects him to speak a language he was never taught. Not a foreign language in the way that French or Mandarin is foreign, something you can study with textbooks and rules and progression, but a language of interiority, a language of the inner life that his entire formation told him was either unnecessary or slightly self-indulgent. And you don't learn that kind of language at 50 the way you learn it at 5. At 5, the categories are being built for the first time, but at 50, you are being asked to retrofit an architecture that has been load-bearing for decades. Watch what happens when someone close to him, his partner, his adult child, a close friend, asks him how he's actually feeling about something. Not what do you think, not what are you going to do about it, but how do you feel? There is a pause that is longer than it should be if the question were easy. He says fine, or okay, or I don't know, frustrated, I guess, and then moves almost immediately to the practical dimension. Frustrated is as deep as he goes, not because there is nothing beneath it, but because frustrated was one of the few emotional words consistently available in the environment where he learned to talk about himself. The others, the more precise, more vulnerable, more interior ones, were not part of the available set. Inadequate, ashamed, afraid, lonely, unseen, overwhelmed. These words exist in his passive vocabulary, and he understands them when he encounters them in a film or a book, but they are not available to him in real time, in a conversation, about himself, in the present tense. The gap between understanding a word and being able to use it to describe your own experience is enormous, and it is a gap that almost no one ever pointed out to him because almost no one around him could see it either. This is where the pattern becomes structural, because the absence of emotional vocabulary doesn't stay contained to conversations. It shapes the entire apparatus of self-knowledge. You can only know what you can name. Not entirely, there are things we know in the body, in impulse, in the quality of a night's sleep, but the kind of knowing that allows for reflection, for pattern recognition, for deliberate navigation of an interior life requires language. Without the language, the interior life doesn't disappear. It continues operating, generating responses, avoidance, irritability, overwork, distance, a kind of relentless forward motion that has no particular destination. But it operates outside of conscious access, running beneath the observable surface of a competent, reliable, functional man. And the man himself, unless something forces the investigation, has no particular reason to notice. He is busy, he is needed, he is providing. The system is working in the sense that systems can work without ever being understood.
The habit of not naming becomes over time something more than a habit. It becomes the architecture of the self. He is not someone who suppresses his feelings. He is someone who genuinely does not experience a strong impulse to name them, because naming was never part of what feelings were for. Feelings were signals that something needed doing, and you responded to the signal by doing the thing. The feeling itself was not the object of attention, it was the arrow pointing toward the object of attention. And after 50 years of operating this way, the arrow and the object have become almost indistinguishable. He does not notice that he is anxious, he notices that the project needs to be finished. He does not notice that he feels unseen, he notices that he is working longer hours than usual. He does not notice that he is grieving something. He notices that he has very little patience for things that used to not bother him. The translation is automatic. The interior state is immediately converted into an external orientation, and the interior state itself, unnamed, unexamined, disappears back beneath the surface. This is not a pathology in any clinical sense, and the investigation is not making that claim. It is a coping architecture built for a specific environment, one that rewarded output, penalized visible vulnerability in men, and provided no tools for the alternative. In that environment, it worked well enough that it became invisible, and things that work well enough to become invisible tend to persist long after the environment that required them has changed. He is now in a different environment. The people he loves most, his partner of 20 years, his adult children, his closest friends, are operating from a different set of assumptions about what connection requires. They expect language. They expect interiority. They expect him to be able to report, with some consistency, on what is actually happening inside him, and he wants to meet them there. This is the part that the observer needs to stay with, because it is where the investigation finds something unexpected. He is not indifferent, not withholding by choice, not protected by the silence in the way that someone is protected when the silence serves them. He is genuinely uncertain how to do what is being asked of him, and that uncertainty is not a strategy, it is the actual condition. And there is something beneath the uncertainty, something that only becomes visible when the investigation goes one layer deeper. He knows that the language exists. He knows that other people use it. He has, in certain moments, late at night or after a film that hit something unexpected, or in the particular quality of a morning when he woke earlier than usual and the house was quiet, felt the edge of something he could not quite reach, something that had weight. Something that, if it had a name, would explain a number of things he has never been able to explain. He does not pursue it, not because he is afraid of it, though that is sometimes part of it, but because the act of pursuing something interior, of following a feeling inward rather than outward, has never been part of his behavioral repertoire. He has the impulse occasionally, and then the impulse passes, and the day continues, and the thing without a name remains nameless. This is the mechanism that has sustained the pattern for decades, not active resistance, not conscious avoidance, but the simple, quiet absence of the habit of pursuit. The habit of sitting inside a feeling long enough for it to become language requires repetition to form, and the repetition requires a model, and the model was not provided. And so the habit was never formed, and the pattern continued long enough to become invisible, and invisible things tend to be treated as natural, and things treated as natural tend to be reproduced. He reproduced it, not intentionally, but in the small daily moments of raising children who watched him operate exactly the way he had watched his father operate. Not the cruelty that no longer fit the culture, not the explicit prohibition of tears or weakness, but the more subtle, more durable thing, the functional, competent, forward-moving orientation that treated the interior life as ambient noise rather than signal. The children watched, and some of them, particularly the daughters who were given different permission by the same culture, developed their own emotional vocabulary and found, eventually, that there was a distance between themselves and their father that neither of them fully understood. He felt the distance. He did not know what to call it. He compensated by being more present in the ways he knew how to be present. He fixed things. He showed up. He was reliable. And the distance remained, not because he failed, but because the distance was located in the domain where his reliability had the least purchase. This is where the investigation reaches a layer that cannot be attributed to any individual man's history, because what has just been described is not a personal story, it is a generational pattern.
The Gen X man who cannot name his emotions did not invent his silence. He inherited it from a culture that had specific ideas about what men were for, ideas that were never formalized in a document, never announced in a policy, never consciously endorsed by most of the men who carried them. They were simply the water of the late 60s, the 70s, the early 80s, a cultural moment that was producing rapid change in almost every visible domain while leaving certain interior assumptions almost entirely undisturbed. The women around him were learning in that same period to name things, developing a language of interior life that was new, politically charged, sometimes clumsy and sometimes too rigid, but undeniably a language. The men watched. Most of them did not enter that conversation, not because they were forbidden, but because no one was particularly inviting them in, and because the habit of entering interior conversations had never been built, and because the cost of not entering was, for a long time, invisible. The cost became visible slowly, in marriages that worked functionally and felt to at least one of the people inside them emotionally empty. In friendships between men that were warm, reliable, and almost entirely organized around activity, because activity was the grammar of male connection, and without it, neither man knew quite how to proceed. It became visible in the quiet, specific loneliness of a man who is surrounded by people who love him and cannot explain why he sometimes feels entirely alone. He does not call it loneliness. He calls it tiredness, a long week, needing some space, and the investigation is not interested in correcting him. It is only interested in noticing what has just been named by the investigation in the place where he offered something else. There is a particular kind of collective blind spot that forms when an entire generation shares the same absence, because when everyone in a room has the same gap in their vocabulary, no one experiences it as a gap. It simply looks like the shape of things. It looks like how men are, not how a specific set of cultural conditions trained men to be within a specific historical window for reasons that had everything to do with economics and war and industrial production and very little to do with anything essential about masculinity, but simply how men are. And that naturalizing move, that conversion of the historical into the essential, is what makes the pattern almost impossible to see from the inside. You cannot see the water when you have been swimming in it since birth. You require at minimum a moment of standing on dry ground. And the culture that produced him did not offer that moment. He is 50 now, or thereabouts, standing in a world that has changed faster than his interior architecture, and the conversation around emotion, around vulnerability, around the interior lives of men is louder than it has ever been. He is not outside that conversation, he is adjacent to it. He reads things that resonate in a way he cannot quite explain. He watches a film that does something to him that he does not have language for. He sits at a dinner table with his adult child who uses words he would never have used at that age, with a fluency that is both impressive and slightly disorienting. He does not know what he feels about any of this, and the fact that he does not know, the fact that the question itself is difficult, is the thing that the investigation has been following from the beginning. Not as a failure, not as a pathology, not as something that requires correction, but as a structure. A coherent, durable, historically produced structure that shaped an entire generation of men in ways that most of them are only now, in the second half of their lives, beginning to see. The investigation doesn't conclude here. It only arrives at a point where the structure is visible enough to be recognized. A man who never learned to name his emotions is not a man without an interior life. He is a man whose interior life was never given the infrastructure of language. And without that infrastructure, the life continues, fully, quietly, persistently, beneath the surface of everything observable, beneath the competence, beneath the reliability, beneath the silences that look from certain angles exactly like composure. The investigation will continue, because the next question, the one that this structure inevitably produces, is not about language at all. It is about what a man organizes his entire identity around when the interior life has never been made available as a resource. That question belongs to the next layer, and the next layer is already waiting. If something in this investigation landed somewhere you didn't expect, you don't need to explain it. That recognition is its own kind of data. Subscribe if you want to continue. Leave a comment if the investigation opened something worth naming.